Okay, so this time we're going to talk about application profiles and policy statements. So this is the definition that we're using for application profile in the toolkit. It's a specification of the metadata that is used in an application. That specification may include the entities, the elements, and the vocabulary encoding schemes that are used, and indeed the string encoding schemes, and the mandatory and repeatable status of elements. There's only one element in the whole toolkit which is mandatory, and that is, guess what? Nomen string, because it's weird. Everything else is optional, and so an application profile is a way of choosing, presetting which options you should choose to catalog any particular type of material or for a particular application. The application profile may also include the preferred recording method as well. So if you're working in the linked data application, then clearly the preferred recording method is going to be IRI. There are a number of benefits to using an application profile. The most obvious one is we have thousands of elements now. Some of those elements have 40 or 50 options in them. So the main utility of a profile is to tell you which of the elements that you should be using for any particular application. It means that you don't have to consider each of the elements in turn and wonder whether you should use it or not. So it tells you what to use. And those of you who are at the pre-conference on Friday will have seen some of this being applied practically using a very, very simple mechanism. It's not suitable for operational purposes, but I think it fairly effectively showed that you could use the profile as the front end to the toolkit, so you don't look at the toolkit directly, you just use the profile, and then you can link through to the appropriate parts of the toolkit as dictated and specified by the profile itself. Again, in the pre-conference workshop, not only was our simple application profile telling the participants which elements were recommended for a particular entity, for example. It can also drive a data input form, and that's exactly what we were doing. So you could use the exact same mechanism. It was a spreadsheet, not only to go to the toolkit, to the right place in the toolkit, but also you could enter data directly into it. And this is another big utility of application profiles, that they can drive data input forms. And we hope to be able to show you that more effectively when RIMP 4 comes out, which will be the new 3R version of RIMP RDA in many metadata formats. But there's another utility of profiles. This is more technical, and there's actually work going on right now. I know that some of the LD4P work has involved looking at application profiles and using a W3C modeling ontology called SHACL, S-H-A-C-L, which is a kind of blank graph. It's a model graph, RDF graph of linked data, which can be used to measure against real world data as a measure of validation and conformance. So an application may say a well-formed set of metadata statements about a person should contain the date of birth of the person. That can be specified in the application profile, and then when you're pulling linked data from another source on the World Wide Web, you can use the application profile to check to see whether indeed there is a date of birth present in the incoming data. And obviously the machine can trap data that's missing this information and signal to you that it's not well formed. And that is the corollary, the same thing, that you can then use that to specify which data to extract from the huge, great, one giant global graph of linked data, which is now forming out in the cloud. So you can imagine that out in the cloud, there may be hundreds and hundreds of different versions of descriptions of the same thing. You don't really want to plow through all of those. What you want to do is get the machine to do it for you. So you give the machine an application profile and you say, I want the data that fits my profile to be extracted and everything else to be ignored. So the application profiles are a very, very powerful device, particularly for machine manipulation of metadata. This is a slide I showed at the pre-conference. In the new toolkit, we have replaced the concepts of comprehensive description, analytic description, and hierarchical description with something which is kind of more aligned with the idea of application profiles. You can, in fact, create any number of data architectures, which is what the traditional method is trying to specify, only allowing you 3 choices essentially. But now you can create data architectures, that is how you relate WEMI and agents and places and time spans together in many, many different ways. So in the toolkit, we have a layer of models of statements that say the data to be well formed as RDA data must conform to these different layers. So the first layer is coherent description. Basically, in traditional terms, that is specifying the primary relationships between work expression, manifestation, and item, and reflecting the cardinality. So an expression may only have one work. This is from FRBR and is carried through the LRM. An item may have only one manifestation, but obviously a manifestation has more than one item, the work has more than one expression. And expressions and manifestations have a many-to-many relationship. So a well-formed description to be coherent should follow that profile. It's a very simple one. But layered on top of that is an idea of a minimum description of an entity. We're not creating our data for machines. We are creating data that machines can manipulate on our behalf. But ultimately, our data has to be read by human beings. And human beings can't read IRIs, and sometimes they can't read identifiers. What human beings want to see are names and access points. So a minimum description of a resource entity has to contain at least one appellation for it to be useful. You can choose whether it's an unstructured description, a structured description, or an identifier. And then layered on top of that is the idea of effective description. So far, so what? My entity is identified by a single appellation. Well, that's not very useful at all. And for a description to be effective, you then move into what we would call an application profile. What does effective mean? It means effective with a particular application in mind. Data for one application may be completely useless in another application, so it's very much bound in with what your application is intended to do. So we have these 3 layers. The bottom 2 layers are pretty well mandatory. You can do whatever you want, but if you want to create effective metadata, you need to have a coherent and a minimum description in place, and then you can layer on top of that your choice of which elements to use and which entities to describe. So this is effectively a kind of layering effect, and tends to suggest that there isn't really anything like a single application profile. It's like a jigsaw puzzle or a Lego construction kit. You have to have a base plate, that's your coherent and minimum description, but then you've got a choice of, in RDA's case, several thousand different kinds of brick. So you can build pretty well anything you want. And you construct that on top of the base. So we have effective description layered on top, and here I've tied these in with the elements that are relevant. So coherent description is primary relationship elements, the minimum description involves the appellation elements, and effective description involves general and specialized elements for describing an entity. Another way of putting this is that profiles can be inherited. So you can build a profile up by inheriting from a previous profile, from a more granular profile. So an effective description using specialized elements, say for music cataloging, audiovisual materials, can be built up on top of and inherit an effective description using general elements, creator, that kind of thing, and that in turn can inherit the minimum description of appellation elements, and that in turn is based on the coherent description. So the idea I'm trying to get across here is that there's no such thing as a single application profile. I mean, you can create one, but it's rather like describing everything as an item. You're going to end up repeating things over and over and over again, which is why Ferber splits the real world item into the 4 areas of description: item, manifestation, expression, and work. And the same kind of idea can be applied to the construction and use of profiles. The context of this is the RDA itself will produce 1 or 2 model profiles, but it's really up to, you don't buy a pre-constructed Lego building. There's no fun in that. You buy a box full of bricks. So we're going to follow something similar. We'll give you some models to work on, and right now the European RDA interest group is looking at one of those kind of ideal application profiles that we might publish. But generally speaking, this is going to be a community effort, and you guys are the community. So, as well as the elements and entities being specified in the profile, there's also the possibility of specifying which options to use. And I've already mentioned recording methods. So your particular application may only want to use one of the options and ignore all of the others. So that can be specified within the profile as well. There is a certain amount of functional overlap here, which is good because it gives you more choice. A profile can specify a vocabulary encoding scheme for an element or a string encoding scheme. But you'll find in the toolkit that there are options for using the RDA vocabulary encoding scheme or using an unspecified other encoding scheme. And we've already discussed the issues with managing syntax encoding string encoding schemes earlier in the discussion here. So in fact, you can either specify directly an application profile, which VES or SES, etc. to use, or you can point to the option in the toolkit, which hints at which one you should use. So here's an extract from the toolkit. When you're recording a structured description for an element that has a vocabulary encoding scheme, you can choose to use a term from the supplied RDA vocabulary encoding scheme, and that is embedded within the toolkit itself. It's our recommended scheme. But there's another option that says you can use a term from any other suitable vocabulary encoding scheme. So if your community prefers to use, go back to the earlier discussion, prefers to use a different scheme for carrier types, then you're free to do so. You don't have to use the RDA one. So if you want to specify to use the RDA vocabulary encoding scheme in the profile, you can just say use this option, and every option has its own URL, IRI. Or you can just state plainly, use the RDA vocabulary encoding scheme without linking to the option that says use the RDA vocabulary encoding scheme. And similarly, a profile might link to the option that says use another vocabulary encoding scheme and then state which scheme to use in your application, or it could just say use this vocabulary encoding scheme. The choice is yours. And it depends very much, I think, on how you use the application profile itself. If it's being used as a data input form, then you're likely to want to link to the toolkit. If it's just a paper specification of a well-formed record, then you can just state what the VES or string encoding scheme to be used is. So here's an example with a string encoding scheme. And this overlaps with what Thomas has been saying. So the condition is that preferred name of person consists of a surname preceded by other parts of the name, such as given names. And the option then is to normalize that as an access point by recording the surname, following it by a comma, and then the parts of the name that precede it. That is a string encoding scheme, that option itself. But as we said in the discussion during Thomas's presentation, this is not scalable. This particular approach needs management, and the RSC will be monitoring and reviewing the situation after the 3R project as different communities and different ways of encoding strings become requirements. You can also, to a certain extent, subsume conditions with an application profile. So quite a few of the instructions are only to be used for particular kinds of entity. In this example, the entity is a diachronic work. And the option is to record values of elements that are associated with most parts, issues, or iterations of a diachronic work. That is the common elements that you find in a serial, such as its title and publisher. But that condition itself could be subsumed into an application profile for serials. So if you had an AP for serials and series, you go straight to the option, and the condition in some sense becomes redundant in your context. So again, there are different ways that you can mix and match these approaches using the toolkit and using application profiles. So what we've discovered as we've been adding these conditional instructions and options to the toolkit is that we're beginning to see a bunch of standard conditions emerge, and you will see the same phrase is used over and over and over again in the toolkit. In fact, we treat it as boilerplate, so if we have to amend that phrase, we only do it once, and the CMS then cascades it throughout the instructions where it's relevant. So we have standard conditions such as a work is a diachronic work, a work is a musical work, a work is an official communication. In fact, these are connected with the pseudo elements, which we're still tackling, primarily through Thomas's work. And similarly, you can have conditions on manifestations. A manifestation may be an aggregate, or it may be a part or iteration of the diachronic work, the manifestation of that. And so what we're seeing then is a whole bunch of standard conditions beginning to emerge. And it's an intriguing idea, and this is something that, as technical officer, I've started to float to the RSC, that we may be able to build up what we could call a condition data bank. And we already have these as boilerplate, which is putting them all in a single file. So maybe we could add structure to that file and have a data bank. And of course, these conditions are highly relevant to specialized application profiles, so that we might be able to reuse these within profiles themselves. And we may be able down the line to generate application profiles based on these standard conditions, and then pass those over to communities to refine and adapt as required. They might also be the basis of specialized manuals. This is something that Jamie's been talking about since before the start of the 3R project, that this may be one way of integrating specialized cataloging manuals within the toolkit itself. So finally, I hope what I've gotten across to you is that application profiles are important, they're powerful, they're flexible, they need managed. And so this is my last slide before I hand over to Jamie. There are a number of questions, I think, that a group like CCDA, PCC, and other cataloging groups should start to consider. Should the management of application profiles, that is creating them, maintaining them, making them available, should that be community-led? The North American community or the European community, or should it be application-led, or both? Should the North American music community do something, or should the international music community do something? We've already mentioned the management of application profiles is connected with the development of RDA. As new elements are added to RDA, how do we alert application profiles that there's now another element that they could consider? Or if we remove an element from RDA, clearly we need to have the profile remove the same element. More contentiously, should we publish application profiles within the toolkit where they're easier to use in context, but they are behind a paywall? Or should we publish them outside the toolkit? Where they can be made freely available to anybody. It's not a free way into the toolkit, of course. You still have to get through the authentication barrier of the paywall, but the application profile itself could be published outside of the toolkit. So these are just some of the questions I think communities need to start thinking about to use the toolkit effectively and to get your users to make effective use of the new toolkit. At that point, I'll hand over to Jamie.
Hello, everyone. So I'm just going to talk really briefly about where we're at with policy statements. We kind of combine this with application profiles, because policy statements are, or can be, a kind of application profile. Right now, we are starting to gear up work on policy statements to add to the new data set. We're at a very early stage, but we're making some very important decisions. And to get through these decisions, I set up what I'll call a planning group. I just named it last night. But it's been around for a couple of weeks and or a month. And we're working with policy statement writers from British Library, German National Library, and Library of Congress, as well as the RSC Secretary and the RSC Technical Team Liaison Officer. So almost, and then me. So everyone's on this group is actually in this room right now, with the exception of our friends from Germany. And I should say the RSC chair has connection to our Basecamp site, so she can monitor what we're up to and let us know if it's bad news or not. I pushed the wrong button, didn't I? Okay. So the goals of this group are to set up requirements for the display of policy statement files and what I call the right rail in RDA pages. So we need to kind of set parameters about how are we going to display a policy statement? How will a policy statement page and browse work in the toolkit? And as some of you may have seen on the beta site, maybe you haven't yet, but on the right side of a page, if you're looking at any page in the toolkit, any RDA page, I should say, there's space in the right column, the far right part of the page. And that's where policy statements will appear, and they'll line up right next to the passage of the instructions that they're referring to. So we need to talk about what's the display requirements for that, how they're going to function, what's the proper markup for policy statements, because we have several challenges in making sure the right policy statement is appearing in the right place. And what's the navigation from policy statement to RDA if necessary, or from RDA to policy statement, etc., and how people can move about between different policy statements they might want to look at. And then we also needed to establish some guidelines about policy placement and content. What kind of things can you do in a policy statement? Can you have examples? Can you have tables? Can you have illustrations, etc.? So these are all things we have to consider. And our approach, now, when I think about policy statements, I think this might be the hardest part of finishing 3R, is going to be policy statement writers. The current policy statement writers are really going to have to go back and look at what they've done in the past, look at what the toolkit is now, and make some kind of hard decisions about how they want to approach things going forward. So it's going to be a lot of work. And one of the things we're going to do with this, what we call the more bang script, which is a little inside 3R core team language. We had a big bang script that generated all the RDA files, and then we had a wee bang script that generated a bunch of new files, relationship element files. So we have this more bang script, and this script is going to basically create all the shell documents for every set of policy statements that's in the toolkit. So policy statement writers don't have to go and go, okay, create file, put title in, put all these things in. What we're going to do is we're going to generate all of that stuff for them with a shell of the title of every place that we think a policy statement is likely to go. It'll already have a link in it, it'll already have a title in it. So we're trying to spare them some of their work. And then of course, we're gonna have so many of these. Obviously, people aren't gonna be able to write a policy or don't want to write a policy statement for every single option or paragraph or whatever. So, you know, we'll have to set up part of the infrastructure so that if you leave it blank, it doesn't appear in the toolkit when it's published. But it's always, that shell's always there for if you want to add a policy statement later. So part of this is also we have to duplicate the RDA file directory for each policy statement. So the organization and structure of policy statements will follow that of RDA. So we anticipate that a policy statement will have a page for each element, just like RDA does. And for each, we'll have a page for each guidance chapter, and a page for the kind of RDA reference information, like capitalization or something like that. So all this stuff will be automatically generated for policy statements, and hopefully that takes a bit of burden off the work for them as they set about doing this evaluation and writing. Right now, we're kind of thinking that policy statements will hit and will generate these shells at anywhere in the toolkit where you see a header or a subheader. They will not happen at the top of a file. They will not happen at the element title level, but they can happen anywhere below that. And then also on options. We foresee policy statements lining up with any place you see a gray option box. There could be a policy statement there. We don't anticipate lining them up with conditions because we think, well, it's just a condition that you shouldn't have a policy statement about a condition. But that's kind of where we're working from right now. And we're finishing up writing these requirements that we have to give to our developer for this war bang script. And that's kind of our first objective, that we hope to have the requirements finished within next week or so, and then turn those around and have discussions with our developer about running the script and hopefully get that created. We hopefully have our idea is that we'll have that infrastructure in place before the English language RDA stabilizes in April, so they can start writing their policy statements right away. So that's just a little update on where policy statements are at. And we're open for questions.
No, we're not.
Oh.
Because you guys took so long to get started that you used up your comment time. I want to get to my presentation, and if there's time at the end of that, so I'll ask you to hold your questions for Gordon and Jamie so I can get to what I wanted to